When Sarah McKinnon stepped between a 600-pound grizzly bear and a bleeding Cherokee boy in the Tennessee mountains, she had no idea that her split-second decision would transform her from a despised outsider into the most protected woman in the entire Cherokee nation. What happened next would challenge everything both peoples believed about courage, loyalty, and the bonds that can form between sworn enemies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Great Smoky Mountains like the breath of ancient spirits, wrapping around the towering oak and hickory trees that had witnessed centuries of Cherokee footsteps along these sacred trails. October of 1838 had brought an early frost to the Cumberland Plateau, and the first crimson leaves drifted down like drops of blood against the forest floor, where Sarah McKinnon knelt beside Sweetwater Creek, filling her wooden bucket with the crystal-clear mountain water that would serve her meager breakfast. Sarah paused in her morning ritual, listening to the symphony of the awakening forest, while her coffee grounds settled in their tin pot. The familiar sounds brought her comfort, in a land where comfort was a luxury she could rarely afford. Somewhere in the distance, a red-tailed hawk screamed its hunting cry, and closer to her cabin, squirrels chattered their territorial disputes among the massive chestnut trees that provided the bulk of her winter food supply. 4 years had passed since consumption claimed her husband William, leaving her alone on 40 acres of mountain land that the government had granted to Union veterans after the war. The soil proved rocky and acidic, unsuitable for most crops, and the growing season at this elevation was brutally short. Her nearest white neighbor lived 8 miles down a treacherous mountain path that became impassable during winter storms, leaving her isolated for months at a time in a wilderness that seemed determined to test every ounce of her determination. Most widows would have sold their claims and returned to the relative safety of established towns, but Sarah possessed the kind of stubborn independence that had driven her family westward from Virginia in the first place. She pulled her wool shawl tighter against the mountain chill and stepped onto the covered porch of her log cabin, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. The thermometer William had nailed to the cabin wall read 34 degrees, unseasonably cold for mid-October. Her small flock of chickens huddled together in their makeshift coop, their feathers fluffed for warmth as they eyed her expectantly. The 3 goats she'd managed to acquire through trade bleated their morning complaints from their pen beside the cabin, demanding the attention and feed that kept them productive through the harsh mountain winters. Sarah scattered corn for the chickens and measured out precious grain for the goats, calculating in her mind how long her supplies would last if winter came early this year. The sound of her axe-splitting kindling echoed across the narrow valley as she worked to replenish the woodpile that would mean the difference between survival and freezing when the deep snows arrived. Each swing sent shockwaves through her shoulders and arms, muscles that had grown strong from necessity rather than choice. William had been the one with the broad back and powerful hands, while Sarah had managed the cooking, gardening, and domestic tasks that kept their small homestead functioning. Death had transformed her into both husband and wife, forcing her to develop capabilities she'd never imagined possessing. As she worked, movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention along the tree line where the forest met her small clearing. At first she thought it might be one of the black bears that frequently raided homesteads this time of year, fattening themselves for winter hibernation. But the movement was too deliberate, too purposeful for a foraging animal. Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward the loaded rifle that leaned against the porch rail, a precaution that had become second nature during her years of solitary mountain life. Living alone this far from civilization meant preparing for every possible threat, from desperate outlaws fleeing justice to wild animals seeking easy prey. The Cherokee had been forcibly removed from these mountains just months earlier, driven westward on what people were already calling the Trail of Tears. But Sarah knew that some had managed to escape into the deep wilderness where soldiers couldn't follow. The government considered any remaining Cherokee to be hostile fugitives, but Sarah had always questioned the justice of driving people from lands their families had occupied for generations. The figure emerged more clearly from the pine forest, moving with an unsteady gait that suggested injury or exhaustion. Sarah's maternal instincts warred with frontier caution as she watched the stranger stumble and catch himself against a large boulder before continuing his approach toward her. Clearing. Something about the way he moved suggested youth rather than threat, desperation rather than menace, but she kept her rifle within reach nonetheless. The morning light revealed what appeared to be a young person wrapped in what looked like a torn and blood-stained blanket. As he drew closer, Sarah could see that he was favoring his left side heavily, and dark stains on the makeshift covering suggested fresh wounds. The boy's approach was neither aggressive nor furtive, but rather the desperate advance of someone who had exhausted all other options and was gambling everything on the mercy of a stranger. "Hello there," Sarah called out in a steady voice, maintaining a safe distance while assessing the level of threat. "Are you injured?" The figure looked up, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A boy, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, with the distinctive features and long black hair of the Cherokee people. His dark eyes held a mixture of pain, weariness, and something else that took her a moment to identify. Hope mixed with resignation, the expression of someone who expected rejection but was hoping desperately to be wrong. Blood had soaked through. The makeshift blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle that suggested either dislocation or fracture. Sarah's mind raced through the implications of this encounter. The Cherokee had been declared enemies of the state by government authorities, and harboring one could be construed as treason against the United States. Yet this was clearly just a wounded child, lost and alone, far from any war party or hostile group. The boy spoke a few words in what Sarah assumed was Cherokee, his tone carrying the universal note of a question. When she shook her head apologetically to indicate she didn't understand, he switched to heavily accented English that spoke of some contact with white missionaries or traders. "You, white woman, alone?" The question carried multiple layers of meaning. Was he asking if she posed a threat, whether others might arrive to help or harm him, if she had protection against potential retaliation for helping a fugitive Cherokee? Sarah chose honesty over strategy. "Yes, I live alone. My husband died 4 years ago." She gestured toward the cabin behind her. "This is my home." The boy's gaze moved from her face to the rifle in her hands, then to the solid structure of the cabin and the signs of permanent settlement around it. Sarah could almost see him calculating distances, exits, and possibilities, despite his obvious pain and exhaustion. Even wounded and desperate, he possessed the situational awareness of someone raised in a dangerous world. "What happened to you?" Sarah asked, noting how he cradled his injured arm. Those wounds looked fresh and serious. The boy's face darkened with remembered terror, and he spoke a single word with unmistakable venom and fear. "Bear." Sarah's blood chilled at the simple declaration. Grizzly bears had been increasingly active this season, driven to lower elevations by drought in the high country and the approach of winter hibernation. Just last week, she'd found massive paw prints around her goat pen and had taken to bringing the animals into the cabin each night. A bear attack would explain the boy's injuries and his presence so far from any known Cherokee settlement. The few Cherokee who had escaped the forced removal were rumored to be hiding in the most remote and inaccessible areas of the mountains, places where even experienced hunters rarely ventured. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Where did this happen? She pressed gently, her medical instincts overriding political caution. The boy pointed toward the high ridges to the northwest, where ancient mountains rose in successive waves toward the distant peaks of what white settlers called the Great Smoky Mountains. Sarah knew that country from her hunting expeditions with William during their early years on the homestead. It was brutal terrain, full of hidden valleys and treacherous ravines where a large predator could easily corner its prey. The remoteness also explained why the boy had traveled so far seeking help. How long ago? The boy held up 3 fingers, then pointed to where the sun had been positioned earlier in the morning. 3 hours, perhaps, though his journey down from the high country would have taken considerable time with those injuries. Sarah noticed he kept glancing nervously toward the forest behind him, as if expecting pursuit of some kind. "Are others looking for you?" she asked carefully. The boy's hesitation spoke volumes about the complexity of his situation. Finally, he nodded slowly, his expression revealing the internal conflict between hope and fear. "Family search," he said in his careful English. "I hunt alone. Get lost. Bear find me instead of deer. Lost while hunting alone." It explained his presence in unfamiliar territory and suggested that somewhere in these mountains, Cherokee families were desperately searching for a missing member. Sarah realized she faced a decision that would echo far beyond this single moment. With implications she couldn't fully comprehend, she could provide basic first aid and send him on his way, minimizing her risk while fulfilling minimal humanitarian obligations. She could alert the military authorities at Fort Campbell, 40 miles south, and let them handle what was technically a matter of Indian relations. Or she could do what every decent person should do when faced with a wounded child, regardless of the political complications involved. The choice seemed obvious until Sarah considered the broader context of current events. The Cherokee removal had been brutal and final, with President Van Buren declaring that any remaining Cherokee were to be considered hostile fugitives, subject to immediate arrest or worse. The entire region remained under martial law, with military patrols authorized to use deadly force against any Cherokee found east of the Mississippi River. If military authorities discovered the boy on her property, Sarah could face charges of harboring fugitives or providing aid to enemies of the United States. The penalties for such crimes could include imprisonment, loss of property, or even execution, depending on how authorities chose to interpret her actions. Worse, if the boy's family came looking for him and found him in her care, would they view her as protector or captor? Sarah had heard conflicting stories about Cherokee treatment of white settlers. Some spoke of noble people who honored courage and showed mercy to those who earned their respect through honest dealing. Others described savage raiders who showed no distinction between combatants and civilians, seeking vengeance for the wrongs inflicted upon their people. The truth probably lay somewhere between these extremes, but the uncertainty made her decision all the more difficult. The boy swayed on his feet as exhaustion finally began to overcome his efforts to remain alert and ready for flight. Sarah watched him struggle to stay upright and realized that the philosophical debate was academic. She could not, in good conscience, allow a child to collapse from blood loss and exposure while she debated political ramifications and potential consequences. "Come inside," she said firmly, setting her rifle aside and moving toward him with the decisive action that had characterized her survival in these mountains. "Let me look at those wounds properly." The boy's eyes widened in surprise. Clearly, not expecting such an offer from a white woman living alone in territory where his people were considered enemies. He took a halting step backward, suspicion warring with desperate need in his expression. "I know something about healing," Sarah explained, though the term was perhaps more generous than her actual training warranted. She'd learned basic medical skills from necessity, treating everything from William's pneumonia to her own injuries from falls and accidents around the homestead. "I can help you heal properly, so infection doesn't set in." Still, the boy hesitated, caught between the ingrained wariness his people had learned toward whites and the obvious sincerity in Sarah's voice and manner. Sarah recognized the internal struggle, remembering her own first encounters with Cherokee traders who had occasionally stopped at frontier settlements during better times. Fear and mistrust flowed both directions, fueled by decades of broken promises, cultural misunderstandings, and escalating violence that had culminated in the forced removal. "What's your name?" she asked, hoping to bridge the gap with basic human connection that transcended political boundaries. The boy studied her face for a long moment, weighing risks against desperate need, before answering with a name that rolled off his tongue with musical cadence, quite different from the harsh consonants of English. "Ayana," he said quietly. "It means eternal blossom." "Ayana," Sarah repeated, trying to approximate his pronunciation with her untrained tongue. "I'm Sarah McKinnon." She gestured toward herself, then toward the cabin. "Will you let me help you, Ayana? Will you trust me enough to come inside where I can treat those wounds properly?" The use of his name seemed to break through some invisible barrier that had been separating them. Ayana's shoulders sagged slightly as the adrenaline that had carried him down from the high country finally began to fade, leaving behind a frightened, injured boy in desperate need of care and compassion. The defenses he'd maintained through sheer force of will were crumbling under the weight of exhaustion and pain. "Bear, still hunt," he said quietly, glancing once more toward the forest with fear that ran deeper than his physical injuries. "Follow. A blood trail. Mountain bears not give up easy when they taste fear." Sarah's spine stiffened as the full implication of his words sank into her consciousness like cold mountain water. The grizzly that had attacked Ayana might well be tracking him, drawn by the scent of blood and the promise of finishing what it had started. Grizzly bears were notoriously persistent hunters, capable of following a trail for many miles if sufficiently motivated by hunger or territorial instinct. "Then we need to get you inside quickly," Sarah said, abandoning any remaining caution and moving to support Ayana's uninjured side. "And we need to clean those wounds before infection becomes a bigger threat than whatever's tracking you." Ayana allowed her assistance, though Sarah could feel the tension in his muscles, ready to flee at the first sign of treachery or danger. Together, they made their way toward the cabin, Sarah's mind already cataloguing the medical supplies she had available and the defensive preparations she might need to make. As they reached the porch steps, a sound from the forest made them both freeze in their tracks. A low, rumbling call echoed across the valley, neither fully roar nor growl, but something in between that spoke of massive size and predatory intelligence. Ayana's face went pale beneath his copper skin, and his grip tightened on Sarah's arm with desperate strength. "Grizzly," he whispered, the word carrying all the terror of his recent encounter with death itself. Sarah helped him up the steps. As quickly as his injuries allowed, her own heart racing as she realized the full gravity of their situation. Not only was she harboring a Cherokee boy in direct violation of federal law, but she was also potentially facing a grizzly bear attack with limited ammunition and no possibility of outside help. As she closed and barred the heavy cabin door behind them, Sarah wondered if her instinct for mercy had just condemned them both to a very dangerous confrontation with one of nature's most formidable predators. The boy slumped into William's old chair by the fireplace, finally allowing exhaustion to claim him, while Sarah checked the loads in her rifle and tried to remember everything William had taught her about defending against large predators. Outside, The mountain wind continued to whisper through the pine trees, but now it carried with it something else entirely. The promise of a test that would challenge everything Sarah thought she knew about courage, compassion, and the true meaning of civilization. In this remote mountain wilderness, far from the laws and prejudices of the civilized world, she had made a choice that could not be undone. Whatever consequences followed would have to be faced with the same determination that had kept her alive and independent in this unforgiving frontier. Ayana's breathing had settled into the rhythm of uneasy sleep, but Sarah remained alert, watching the windows and listening for sounds that didn't belong to the natural symphony of the mountain morning. She had chosen mercy over safety, humanity over policy, and now she would discover whether that choice would prove to be wisdom or the gravest mistake of her life. Dawn brought no relief to Sarah's vigil. She had dozed fitfully in William's old rocking chair, rifle across her lap, starting awake at every creak of settling timber or shift in the mountain wind. Ayana had slept more peacefully than she'd expected, his young body finally surrendering to exhaustion after the trauma of his escape from the Grizzly's domain. In the pale morning light filtering through her cabin's single window, Sarah could properly assess the extent of his injuries for the first time. 3 jagged gashes ran across his left shoulder, deep enough to expose muscle beneath torn flesh. The wounds had clotted during the night, creating dark scabs that would need careful cleaning to prevent infection. His left forearm bore the distinctive puncture marks of massive claws, and a long scratch along his ribs suggested the attack had been prolonged rather than a single swipe. Most concerning was the unnatural angle of his left wrist, clearly broken when he'd tried to fend off the bear's assault. Sarah had seen similar injuries during her years as an unofficial healer for isolated mountain families. The bone would need to be set properly, a painful process that would test both their resolve. She heated water over the fire and gathered her medical supplies, whiskey for cleaning and pain relief, needle and thread salvaged from her sewing kit, clean cotton cloth torn from one of William's old shirts, and a precious jar of honey that served as both antiseptic and healing salve. Ayana stirred as she approached with steaming water and fresh bandages, his dark eyes immediately alert despite obvious pain. The wariness hadn't left him completely, but Sarah sensed a shift in his attitude toward her. Trust was beginning to replace fear, though she knew it remained fragile and conditional. "Bear?" Ayana asked immediately, his voice hoarse from sleep and dehydration. Sarah poured him a cup of water before answering, noting how eagerly he drank despite his attempts to maintain dignity and control. "No sign since last night," she replied, though she'd heard something large moving through the forest just before dawn. Whether it was the grizzly or simply one of the black bears common to these mountains, she couldn't say. "But we need to clean these wounds properly before infection sets in. Mountain injuries turn poisonous quickly if not treated right." Ayana nodded solemnly, understanding that infection in the wilderness meant almost certain death. There were no doctors within days of travel, and the few frontier remedies available required supplies that most isolated settlers couldn't afford. Sarah began with the shoulder wounds, carefully cleaning away dried blood and forest debris with a gentleness that seemed to surprise the young Cherokee. "You are brave," she commented, beginning to stitch the deepest gash with careful precision. Ayana gripped the chair arms tightly, but made no sound as she worked, displaying the stoicism that Cherokee culture demanded of its young warriors. "How old are you, Ayana?" 16 winters, he replied in his careful English, each word chosen deliberately. "Old enough to hunt with men, young enough to get lost following wrong trail." Sarah detected a note of shame in his voice, the embarrassment of a young person who had made a mistake that endangered not only himself, but potentially his entire family. "Getting lost happens to experienced hunters too," she assured him while working on the puncture wounds. "These mountains can confuse anyone, especially when weather changes suddenly." As she cleaned and dressed his injuries, Ayana began sharing details of his ordeal that painted a picture both terrifying and heartbreaking. He'd been part of a small hunting party that included his father and 2 uncles, tracking a large elk herd toward traditional winter feeding grounds that their people had used for countless generations. The hunting party had been forced to venture much deeper into the wilderness than usual, seeking game in territories they'd avoided since the soldiers began their systematic removal of all Cherokee from ancestral lands. Food had become scarce in their hidden mountain refuge, and winter was approaching with the relentless certainty that would mean starvation for the weakest members of their group. "Soldiers take all good hunting grounds," Ayana explained, wincing, as Sarah cleaned the broken wrist. "Push our people to places where deer are few, streams run shallow, earth gives poor harvest. We hunt in forbidden places or watch children grow thin with hunger." The simple statement carried the weight of a people's suffering, forced to choose between starvation and violating the laws that had made their very existence illegal. Ayana had been following what appeared to be fresh elk sign when fog rolled in from the higher elevations, a common occurrence in these mountains that could disorient even experienced trackers. The mist had been so thick he couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, turning familiar landmarks into ghostly shapes that offered no guidance. "3 days I walk in circles," he continued, gritting his teeth as Sarah began the delicate process of setting his broken wrist. "Find same stream 4 times, same fallen tree, same rock formation. When fog lift, mountains look strange, not home mountains. Everything wrong direction." The Grizzly had found him while he was drinking. From a mountain stream, approaching silently through dense underbrush, with the patient stealth that made these predators so dangerous. Only his father's training in wilderness awareness had given Ayana enough warning to dive behind a fallen log before the massive bear launched its attack. "Bear bigger than any I see before," Ayana said quietly, his voice carrying the trauma of someone who had looked death in the face and barely escaped. "Scars on face, white fur around muzzle, old bear, smart bear, know how to hunt people." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach as she realized they might be dealing with a rogue grizzly, one that had learned to associate humans with food. Such bears were extremely dangerous because they lost their natural fear of people and actively sought out human settlements. The attack had been swift and savage. The grizzly's first swipe had caught Ayana across the shoulder and ribs, sending him tumbling behind the log that had saved his life. When he'd tried to crawl away, the bear had reached over the barrier with claws that seemed as long as hunting knives, opening the wounds on his forearm and breaking his wrist when he'd instinctively tried to protect his face. "I play dead," Ayana continued, describing the terrifying minutes when the grizzly had circled the log, testing whether its prey was truly finished. "Bear smell blood, hear heart beating, but confused when I not move. Finally it go away, but not far. I hear it moving in forest, waiting to see if I try to run." Escape had required the kind of patience and courage that few people possessed. Ayana had waited nearly an hour, lying motionless while listening to the grizzly moving through the underbrush around his hiding place. Only when complete silence had fallen did he risk moving, crawling on his belly until he was far enough away to attempt standing and walking. The journey down from the high country had been a nightmare of pain and endurance. His broken wrist made climbing nearly impossible, forcing him to find routes around obstacles that would normally present no challenge. Several times he'd lost consciousness from blood loss, awakening hours later with no memory of how much ground he'd covered or in which direction. "Why did you come to my cabin specifically?" Sarah asked as she finished bandaging his injuries. "There are other homesteads closer to where the attack happened." Ayana's answer revealed a level of desperation that made Sarah's heart ache for his suffering. "Cherokee know about white medicine woman who live alone in mountains," he said quietly. "Stories say she trade fair, not cheat, not report Cherokee hunters to soldiers. Old people say she has healing spirit, sees past skin color to person underneath." Sarah was surprised to learn that her reputation had spread among the hidden Cherokee communities. She'd occasionally traded with Cherokee hunters during better times, exchanging medical supplies and food for furs and crafted goods. She'd always tried to deal honestly and fairly, but she hadn't realized these interactions had created a network of trust that extended beyond individual relationships. "When bear attack, I remember stories," Ayana continued. "Know if I reach medicine woman cabin, maybe I live. Maybe she see wounded boy instead of enemy Cherokee." The simple faith he'd placed in her character moved Sarah more than any formal recognition could have. In his darkest hour, this young man had gambled his life on the belief that she possessed enough humanity to see past racial and political boundaries. Their conversation was interrupted by sounds from outside that made both of them freeze. The distinctive call of a mountain blue jay, but repeated in a pattern that Sarah had never heard in nature. 3 short calls, followed by 2 longer ones. Then silence. Ayana's face went pale as he recognized something Sarah didn't understand. "What is it?" she whispered, moving to the window to peer through gaps in the wooden shutters. The forest appeared peaceful, with morning sunlight filtering through the canopy and birds moving normally through the branches. But she'd learned to trust the instincts of people who'd grown up in wilderness environments. "Cherokee signal," Ayana said quietly. "Search party close. They find trail, follow to here." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If Cherokee searchers had tracked Ayana to her cabin, they would find him in the care of a white woman during a time when any interaction between the races was considered hostile by government authorities. How would they interpret her actions? As kindness deserving gratitude, or as evidence that she'd captured their missing member? "Are they your family?" she asked, hoping for the best while preparing for complications she couldn't fully anticipate. Ayana nodded, relief and anxiety warring in his expression. "Father, uncles, maybe others. They searched 3 days, very worried." He paused, studying Sarah's face. "You afraid? Cherokee not hurt white medicine woman who saved Cherokee boy, but if soldiers come..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah understood perfectly that her situation was about to become exponentially more complicated. The sound of approaching horses reached them next, multiple riders moving through the forest with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. Sarah counted at least 4 distinct sets of hoofbeats, possibly more. Through the window, she caught glimpses of movement among the trees as the riders approached her clearing. "What should I do?" Sarah asked, realizing that the next few minutes would determine not only her immediate safety, but potentially the future of relationships between isolated Cherokee families and white settlers who might choose cooperation over conflict. "Show no fear," Ayana advised, struggling to sit up straighter despite his injuries. "Cherokee respect courage above all things. You save life of family member. That creates sacred debt that cannot be ignored. But you must meet them as equal, not as supplicant begging for mercy." 4 Cherokee men emerged from the forest, riding horses with the easy grace of people born to the saddle. Sarah stepped onto her porch with Ayana beside her, making sure the rifle remained visible but not threatening. The lead rider was clearly Ayana's father, bearing the same distinctive features and carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. When he saw his son alive and standing, the Cherokee leader's stern expression softened with relief so profound it transcended any cultural boundaries. He dismounted and approached the porch with measured steps, his eyes taking in Ayana's bandaged wounds and Sarah's medical supplies with professional assessment. "I am Running Bear," he said in English that was more polished than his son's, suggesting greater contact with white traders or missionaries. "This woman saved my son's life." The question was directed at Ayana, but the Cherokee leader's eyes never left Sarah's face, reading her character with the intensity of someone whose survival had always depended on accurate judgment of other people's intentions. "Medicine woman find me bleeding, dying from bear attack," Ayana replied formally. "Clean wounds, set broken bone, give food and shelter when soldiers would shoot Cherokee on sight. I owe sacred debt that can never be repaid." Running Bear's gaze moved to the medical supplies visible through the open cabin door, then to the careful bandaging that spoke of genuine skill and compassion. Sarah sensed that she was being evaluated according to criteria she didn't fully understand, but the thoroughness of her medical care was clearly creating a positive impression. "White woman," Running Bear said directly to Sarah, his voice carrying the weight of formal ceremony. "You risk much to help Cherokee boy when your government declares us enemies. Why you choose danger for people not your own?" The question went to the heart of everything that had motivated Sarah's actions. She considered her answer carefully, aware that her words would influence relationships that extended far beyond this moment. "Because he needed help, and I could provide it," she replied simply. That seemed more important than whatever politicians in Washington might think about it. The straightforward honesty of her response seemed to resonate with Running Bear in ways that elaborate explanations could never have achieved. Sarah watched understanding dawn in his eyes as he recognized that her motivations were as simple and direct as his own would have been in similar circumstances. Running Bear translated Sarah's words for the other Cherokee men, who had been listening intently despite the language barrier. Their responses suggested approval, mixed with continued caution, the reaction of people who had learned through bitter experience that white promises often proved worthless when tested by adversity. "Among Cherokee people," Running Bear said formally, "woman who saves family member becomes family herself. Sacred debt creates sacred obligation that extends to protection, sharing, mutual support in times of trouble. This not just words, this sacred law that binds all Cherokee people." Sarah felt the weight of what he was describing settle around her like an invisible cloak. She was being offered something unprecedented in the current political climate, protection and kinship from people who had every reason to hate anyone sharing her skin color. "I'm honored," Sarah replied carefully, "but I need to understand what such an arrangement might mean for both of us. These are dangerous times for any cooperation between our peoples." Running Bear's expression grew grave as he acknowledged the political realities that made their situation precarious. Soldiers hunt Cherokee like animals, Cherokee who help whites face suspicion from own people. But sacred debt, stronger than politics, older than governments. What matters is honor, loyalty, protection of those who show courage when courage demanded. The Cherokee leader paused, studying Sarah's face with renewed intensity. "You willing to accept sacred bond that cannot be broken by changing times or political pressure?" Sarah realized she was being offered a choice that would fundamentally alter her life in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. Accepting would provide protection and alliance with people who knew these mountains better than any white settler ever could. It would also mark her as a traitor in the eyes of authorities who considered any cooperation with Cherokee to be treasonous collaboration with enemies of the state. But the alternative was to send Ayana away with his father and return to her isolated existence, knowing that she'd missed an opportunity to build bridges between peoples who might otherwise remain enemies forever. The choice seemed clear when she considered the young man whose life she'd saved, and the father whose relief and gratitude transcended any artificial boundaries created by politicians and soldiers. "I accept," Sarah said firmly, extending her hand in the gesture of respect that frontier culture recognized as binding commitment. "Whatever obligations come with sacred debt, I'll honor them to the best of my ability." Running Bear grasped her hand with both of his, sealing an agreement that would reshape both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. As the Cherokee men prepared to depart with Ayanna, who was now strong enough to travel with assistance, Running Bear delivered a promise that carried the weight of prophecy. "Medicine Woman, now under protection of Cherokee Nation. Any harm to her brings vengeance from all Cherokee people. This sacred law that will be honored even if it costs lives of warriors." The words hung in the mountain air like smoke from a ceremonial fire, carrying implications that would ripple far beyond this isolated cabin. Sarah had chosen mercy over caution, humanity over politics, and in doing so had created bonds that would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But as she watched the Cherokee party disappear into the forest, with Ayanna safely among them, she felt a sense of rightness about her decision that transcended any rational calculation of risks and benefits. The die had been cast. There could be no turning back from the choice she'd made, and whatever consequences followed would have to be faced with the same courage that had led her to shelter a wounded boy when logic and law demanded she turn him away. In the deep wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains, individual acts of compassion were about to collide with the harsh realities of a nation determined to eliminate the Cherokee people entirely. The test of sacred bonds was about to begin. 2 days after Running Bear's departure with Ayanna, Sarah discovered she was being watched. It started as a feeling, the subtle sensation of eyes upon her that raised the hair on her neck as she went about her morning chores. When she looked toward the forest, she saw nothing unusual, but her instincts, honed by 4 years of solitary mountain life, insisted that something had changed in the rhythm of her isolated world. The realization crystallized when she found fresh boot prints in the soft earth beside Sweetwater Creek, prints that definitely belonged to military boots rather than Cherokee moccasins or settler work shoes. Someone had been observing her cabin from the concealment of the dense rhododendron thickets that lined the stream, and that someone possessed the discipline to remain hidden while conducting surveillance of her daily routines. Sarah's blood ran cold as she counted at least 3 distinct sets of prints, suggesting a patrol rather than a lone scout. The implications struck her like lightning in a clear sky. Word of her interaction with the Cherokee had somehow reached military authorities, and they were now treating her homestead as a potential enemy position worthy of reconnaissance and possible action. She returned to her cabin with forced casualness, aware that any sudden change in behavior might precipitate a confrontation she wasn't prepared to handle. Once inside, she checked her weapons and supplies, while her mind raced through possible explanations for the military interest. Perhaps a neighbor had witnessed the Cherokee visitors and reported suspicious activity. Maybe army patrols had discovered Cherokee sign leading to her property. Or worst of all, perhaps Ayanna's rescue had been observed by hostile parties seeking to create trouble for both communities. The waiting proved more nerve-wracking than immediate confrontation would have been. Sarah went through her daily routines with exaggerated normalcy, feeding her animals and tending her garden, while acutely aware that every movement was likely being observed and recorded. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance began to take its toll, making her question every decision and second-guess every action. On the 3rd day of this tense standoff, the soldiers finally revealed themselves. 6 mounted troopers emerged from the forest in the early morning mist, their blue uniforms marking them as regular army rather than local militia. They approached with the confident bearing of men who held all the advantages and expected immediate compliance with their demands. The officer in charge was a young lieutenant whose pristine uniform and nervous manner suggested recent graduation from military academy rather than frontier experience. Lieutenant Parker introduced himself with formal courtesy that barely concealed underlying suspicion about Sarah's activities and loyalties. "Mrs. McKinnon," he announced from horseback, his voice carrying the crisp accent of Eastern education. "I'm Lieutenant James Parker of the 3rd Infantry Regiment. We've received reports of unauthorized contact between yourself and hostile Cherokee elements in this area. I'm here to investigate these allegations and ensure compliance with federal Indian policy." Sarah stepped onto her porch with the rifle visible but not threatening, drawing upon every lesson William had taught her about dealing with authority figures who held power over frontier settlers. "Lieutenant Parker," she replied evenly. "What specific reports are you investigating? I live alone here and haven't been aware of violating any federal policies." The lieutenant's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her denial, but he was clearly uncertain about how to proceed. "Without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, ma'am, we have reliable intelligence suggesting that Cherokee fugitives have been observed in this vicinity, and that someone in this area may have provided them with aid or shelter." The careful phrasing told Sarah that the military didn't have definitive proof of her actions, only suspicions based on indirect evidence or unreliable witnesses. This gave her room to maneuver, but she would need to be extremely careful about how she responded to their questions. "I've seen no Cherokee in this area, Lieutenant," she said truthfully. Running Bear's party had taken Ayana away 2 days earlier, so there were currently no Cherokee on her property. "Though I have noticed increased bear activity recently. Found tracks around my livestock pens and heard roaring in the forest that kept me awake several nights." Lieutenant Parker exchanged glances with his sergeant, a grizzled veteran whose skeptical expression suggested he wasn't buying Sarah's explanation entirely. The sergeant urged his horse closer to the cabin, studying the ground with professional interest. "Fresh horse tracks here, ma'am," Sergeant Morrison observed, pointing to areas where the Cherokee horses had left clear impressions in the soft earth. "Multiple animals, unshod hooves, that's Indian ponies, not wild horses or settler stock." Sarah felt her carefully constructed story beginning to crumble under professional scrutiny, but she maintained her composure while searching for plausible alternatives. "There are wild horses in these mountains, Sergeant. Escaped stock from abandoned homesteads, horses released by settlers who couldn't maintain them through hard winters." "These tracks are too fresh for wild horses, ma'am," Morrison pressed. "No more than 3 days old, and the pattern suggests riders who knew exactly where they were going. That's not the random movement of loose stock." Lieutenant Parker was studying Sarah's face with the intensity of someone trying to read guilt or deception in her expression. "Mrs. McKinnon, harboring Cherokee fugitives is a federal crime punishable by imprisonment or worse. If you have information about Cherokee presence in this area, it would be wise to share it voluntarily, rather than forcing us to discover it through other means." The implied threat was clear, but Sarah had survived too much to be intimidated by a nervous young officer who was probably more frightened than she was. "Lieutenant, I've told you the truth as I know it. If you have evidence of specific crimes, I suggest you present it. Otherwise, I have work to do that won't wait for military investigations." The boldness of her response clearly surprised Parker, who was accustomed to frontier settlers showing more deference to military authority. But before he could formulate a response, sounds from the forest interrupted their confrontation in the most dramatic way possible. A series of Cherokee bird calls echoed across the valley, too complex and organized to be natural, clearly representing some form of communication between hidden observers. Sarah recognized the pattern from Ayana's explanation of Cherokee signaling methods, though she couldn't interpret the specific message being conveyed. The effect on the soldiers was immediate and electric. Weapons were drawn, and horses wheeled to face potential threats from multiple directions, as the troopers realized they might be surrounded by unseen enemies. Lieutenant Parker's face went pale as he understood that his small patrol was potentially outnumbered and outmaneuvered by opponents who knew the terrain better than any white force ever could. "How many are there?" he demanded of Sarah, as if she possessed intelligence about Cherokee movements and intentions. "What are they planning?" Sarah could honestly claim ignorance about Cherokee plans, but she recognized that the situation was spiraling toward violence that could destroy everything she'd worked to build. The sacred bond with Running Bear's people was about to be tested by the very authorities who considered such relationships treasonous. "I don't know what they're planning," she replied truthfully, "but I suspect they're more interested in protecting someone they consider family than in attacking American soldiers without provocation." The admission slipped out before Sarah could stop herself, revealing more about her relationship with the Cherokee than she'd intended. Parker's eyes widened as he processed the implications of her words. "Family," he repeated sharply. "Are you claiming kinship with hostile Cherokee elements, Mrs. McKinnon?" The question hung in the mountain air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that could reshape Sarah's entire future. She realized that her spontaneous honesty had backed her into a corner where half-truths and evasions would no longer suffice. Before she could answer, the Cherokee bird calls were answered by similar signals from different directions, creating a pattern of communication that surrounded the small military patrol. Sergeant Morrison was counting the signals. With professional attention, his expression growing more concerned as he realized the scope of the Cherokee presence. "At least 8 positions, sir," he reported quietly to Parker. "Maybe more. They've got us bracketed from multiple firing positions if this turns hostile." The tactical situation had shifted dramatically in favor of the Cherokee, who had demonstrated their ability to approach undetected and establish superior positioning before revealing their presence. Lieutenant Parker was faced with a dilemma that his military training had never adequately prepared him to handle. He could attempt to arrest Sarah and risk a firefight with superior Cherokee forces, or he could withdraw and report that the situation required reinforcements and different tactics. Neither option offered clear advantages or guaranteed outcomes. Deadlock was broken by the appearance of a lone Cherokee warrior who emerged from the forest with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in wilderness environments. Sarah recognized him as one of Running Bear's companions from the rescue party, though she didn't know his name or specific role within the Cherokee community. The warrior approached with weapons visible, but not immediately threatening, demonstrating the kind of controlled confidence that suggested extensive combat experience. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to speaking for others. "White soldiers," he called out in a voice that carried clearly across the clearing, "you stand on sacred ground. Threaten. Woman under Cherokee protection. This bring consequences you may not survive." Lieutenant Parker's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Sergeant Morrison's restraining gesture stopped him from drawing the weapon that could trigger a massacre. "We're here on official United States Army business," Parker replied, his voice higher than usual with stress and uncertainty. "This woman is suspected of providing aid to fugitive Cherokee in violation of federal law." The Cherokee warrior's expression hardened at the accusation, and Sarah could see anger building behind his carefully controlled demeanor. "Medicine woman saved Cherokee boy from bear attack," the warrior replied with dignity that transcended the political complications of the moment. "Sacred debt, make her family to all Cherokee people. Harm to her bring blood vengeance that will not end until honor satisfied. The formal nature of his declaration carried weight that even inexperienced officers couldn't ignore. This wasn't a casual threat or momentary anger, but the invocation of cultural laws that would bind the Cherokee to specific actions, regardless of practical consequences. Parker was clearly out of his depth, facing a situation that required diplomatic skills rather than military force. "I'm not here to harm anyone," he said carefully. "I'm investigating reports of illegal activity. If Mrs. McKinnon has violated federal law, she'll face appropriate consequences through proper legal channels." "White law not recognize sacred debt," the warrior observed accurately, "but sacred debt older than white law, stronger than white soldiers. Medicine woman now under protection that cannot be withdrawn or negotiated away." Sarah realized that she was witnessing a clash between two entirely different systems of law and obligation, with herself caught in the middle of contradictions that might prove impossible to resolve peacefully. The Cherokee warrior continued his explanation with the patience of someone educating children about adult matters. Cherokee people scattered by white soldiers, driven from ancestral lands, hunted like animals, but sacred law still binding on all Cherokee wherever they hide. Medicine woman who saved Cherokee life become Cherokee family. Attack on her, attack on all Cherokee people. Lieutenant Parker was struggling to process the implications of what he was hearing. Military doctrine taught that Indians were either hostile or pacified, enemies or allies, with no middle ground for complex relationships that transcended political boundaries. The concept of sacred obligations that overrode governmental authority challenged everything he'd been taught about frontier management and Indian relations. "Are you threatening United States military personnel?" Parker asked, seeking clarity about Cherokee intentions, even as he recognized that such clarity might force him into actions he wasn't prepared to take. The Cherokee warrior's response demonstrated the kind of sophisticated thinking that military stereotypes about savage mentality completely failed to anticipate. "Not threatening," the warrior replied calmly, "explaining consequences of actions. You consider taking Cherokee people peaceful when possible, but sacred law require protection of family members regardless of political complications. You choose what happens next." The ball was now in Parker's court, but every option carried risks that could escalate far beyond his ability to control. Attacking would almost certainly result in casualties among his men and create an incident that could justify massive military retaliation against all Cherokee. Withdrawing would suggest weakness and might encourage further Cherokee defiance of federal authority. Sarah recognized that the moment balanced on a knife's edge, with her own fate and the future of Cherokee-white relations hanging in the balance. The sacred bond that had seemed like such a blessing 2 days earlier was now threatening to become a catalyst for violence that could destroy both communities. As tensions reached their peak, another sound cut through the mountain air with ominous significance. The distant bugle call of a much larger military force approaching through the forest, suggesting that Lieutenant Parker's patrol was merely the advance element of a major operation. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that the stakes were about to increase exponentially, with consequences that none of them could control or predict. The Cherokee warrior's expression tightened as he too recognized the sound of approaching reinforcements. The tactical balance that had favored Cherokee forces was about to shift dramatically in favor of superior numbers and firepower. The sacred bond that protected Sarah was about to face its most severe test, with the outcome determining whether mercy could indeed triumph over military doctrine, or whether the forces of hatred and fear would prove stronger than the bonds forged through individual acts of courage and compassion. In the gathering tension of that mountain morning, Sarah, understood that her simple choice to help a wounded boy was about to collide with the full weight of a nation's policy toward the Cherokee people. The consequences would ripple far beyond this isolated cabin, potentially determining the fate of hidden Cherokee communities throughout the Great Smoky Mountains. The moment of truth had arrived, and there would be no turning back from whatever followed. The thunder of approaching cavalry shattered the tense silence as Colonel Marcus Thornhill led 40 mounted soldiers into Sarah's clearing with the overwhelming force of federal authority. The contrast between Lieutenant Parker's small patrol and this military juggernaut was stark and terrifying. Thornhill commanded from the front rank like a general leading a charge, his weathered face bearing the hard lines of a career soldier who had built his reputation on the systematic subjugation of native peoples. Sarah's heart plummeted as she recognized Thornhill's insignia and reputation. This was the man responsible for some of the most brutal episodes of Cherokee removal. A soldier who had made his name by showing no mercy to men, women, or children who stood between him and his objectives. His presence here meant that her situation had escalated far beyond local military concerns into matters of territorial policy and federal Indian relations. "Lieutenant Parker," Thornhill barked without dismounting, his voice carrying the whip-crack authority of superior rank, "report on the situation here." Parker snapped to attention with the nervous precision of a junior officer facing a notoriously demanding superior. "Sir, we've confirmed Cherokee presence in this area and suspect Mrs. McKinnon of providing unauthorized aid to fugitive Indians. The situation has become complicated by apparent Cherokee protection of the civilian." Thornhill's cold eyes swept the clearing, taking in the Cherokee warrior still standing in plain sight, the tactical positions suggested by recent signals, and Sarah herself standing defiantly on her porch despite being vastly outnumbered. "Complicated?" Thornhill repeated with dangerous softness. "Lieutenant, there are no complications in federal Indian policy. There are only legal settlers and illegal Indians, lawful citizens and treasonous collaborators. Which category applies here seems abundantly clear." The colonel finally dismounted, his movements deliberate and threatening as he approached Sarah. With the confidence of someone who had never encountered resistance he couldn't overcome through superior force. "Mrs. McKinnon," he said formally, his voice carrying the chill of absolute authority. "I am Colonel Marcus Thornhill, commanding officer of Cherokee removal operations in this territorial district. You are under arrest for violation of federal Indian policy, providing aid and comfort to enemy combatants and treason against the United States of America." The charges hit Sarah like physical blows, each one carrying potential penalties that could mean imprisonment, loss of property, or even execution depending on how military courts chose to interpret her actions. But even as fear gripped her heart, anger at the injustice of the situation gave her strength to respond with dignity rather than panic. "Colonel," she replied steadily, "I provided medical aid to a wounded child. If that constitutes treason in your interpretation of law, then your law has lost all connection to justice or humanity." Thornhill's expression hardened at her defiance, clearly unaccustomed to civilians who refused to be intimidated by his reputation and authority. "Justice, Mrs. McKinnon, is the protection of American citizens from savage depredations. Humanity is ensuring that our children grow up in civilized communities rather than constant fear of Indian raids. Your sentimental attachment to individual Indians blinds you to the larger threat they represent to everything we've built in this territory." The Cherokee warrior, who had been observing this exchange, stepped forward with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. When he spoke, his voice carried new urgency mixed with barely controlled anger at Thornhill's characterization of his people. "White colonel speaks of savagery while threatening woman who showed mercy to wounded child. Who is savage in this story?" The warrior's English remained carefully controlled, but Sarah could see the effort it cost him to maintain diplomatic language when facing the man responsible for so much Cherokee suffering. Thornhill's hand moved to his saber hilt as he turned to face the Cherokee warrior with undisguised contempt. "I don't negotiate with hostiles, and I don't tolerate their presence on American soil. You will surrender immediately or face the consequences of armed resistance to federal authority." "This warrior surrenders to no man," came the reply, delivered with quiet dignity that somehow carried more menace than any shouted threat could have conveyed. "Sacred law binds Cherokee people to protect Medicine Woman. Sacred law older than white government, stronger than white soldiers." The standoff had crystallized into exactly the kind of confrontation that Sarah had feared most. Two incompatible systems of law and authority were about to collide with potentially catastrophic results for everyone involved. Thornhill represented the crushing weight of federal power, while the Cherokee warrior embodied cultural obligations that could not be compromised regardless of practical consequences. "Sacred law," Thornhill laughed harshly. "The only law that matters here is federal authority backed by military force. Your sacred laws died with your nation when we removed your people from lands they had no right to occupy." The colonel's deliberate provocation was clearly intended to goad the Cherokee into actions that would justify massive retaliation. But the warrior maintained his composure with remarkable self-control. "Cherokee nation not dead," the warrior replied calmly. "Cherokee people scattered but not destroyed. Sacred law lives in hearts of all Cherokee wherever they hide. Medicine Woman now protected by sacred law that Colonel cannot break with soldiers or threats." Thornhill was growing visibly frustrated with his inability to intimidate either Sarah or the Cherokee warrior into submission. His entire career had been built on the premise that superior force could overcome any resistance, but he was facing opponents who seemed willing to die rather than abandon their principles. "Sergeant Major," Thornhill commanded, turning to his senior non-commissioned officer, "deploy the men in battle formation. We're going to end this Cherokee defiance once and for all." The order sent ripples of activity through the cavalry ranks. As 40 soldiers began positioning themselves for combat against an enemy they couldn't see but knew was present in overwhelming numbers. Sarah realized with growing horror that Thornhill was deliberately escalating toward violence, perhaps believing that a decisive military victory here would serve as an example to other Cherokee communities still hiding in the mountains. The sacred bond that was supposed to protect her was about to become the catalyst for a massacre that could claim dozens of lives. "Colonel, wait!" she called out desperately. "There has to be another way to resolve this situation. Violence here will only create more hatred and resistance." But Thornhill's expression suggested that creating hatred and resistance might actually serve his purposes by justifying even harsher policies against all Cherokee people. "Mrs. McKinnon," he replied coldly, "you forfeited any voice in this matter. When you chose collaboration with enemies of the United States, the time for negotiation ended when these hostiles chose armed resistance over lawful surrender." The Cherokee warrior was clearly recognizing the futility of further dialogue with Thornhill, but before he could signal his hidden companions to begin what would certainly be a devastating ambush, another voice cut through the tension with unexpected authority. "Colonel Thornhill, stand down your men immediately." Everyone turned to see a new arrival emerging from the forest, a figure whose presence changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Major General Andrew Morrison rode into the clearing with only 2 aides, but his insignia and bearing commanded instant attention from every soldier present. Sarah's heart leaped with desperate hope as she recognized Morrison's reputation as one of the few senior officers who had consistently advocated for more humane treatment of Cherokee people during the removal process. His presence here suggested that someone in higher authority had taken notice of the situation and decided to intervene before it spiraled completely out of control. "General Morrison," Thornhill stammered, clearly not expecting oversight from such a high-ranking officer. "Sir, I wasn't aware that you were monitoring this operation." Morrison dismounted with deliberate calm, his weathered features revealing nothing of his intentions as he surveyed the tactical situation that had developed around Sarah's cabin. "Colonel, when reports reached headquarters about potential Cherokee resistance involving civilian casualties, I decided that direct oversight was necessary," Morrison replied in the measured tones of someone accustomed to diffusing explosive situations. "What exactly is the nature of the threat here?" Thornhill's account was carefully crafted to emphasize Cherokee hostility, while minimizing any suggestion that his own actions might have escalated the situation unnecessarily. "Sir, we have confirmed Cherokee presence in violation of removal orders, civilian collaboration with hostile Indians, and armed resistance to federal authority. The situation requires immediate military action to prevent further defiance of government policy." Morrison's expression suggested that he was hearing significant details that Thornhill's report had omitted. "And the civilian in question? What specific crimes has she committed?" The general's attention focused on Sarah with the intensity of someone gathering first-hand information rather than relying on subordinate reports. "Mrs. Sarah McKinnon, sir," Sarah replied, before Thornhill could characterize her actions through his prejudicial lens. "I provided medical treatment to a wounded Cherokee boy who was attacked by a grizzly bear. If that constitutes a crime, then I'm guilty as charged." Morrison studied her face with the keen eye of someone who had learned to read character under pressure. "Medical treatment for bear attack injuries. That suggests emergency humanitarian aid rather than planned collaboration with hostile forces." The distinction was subtle but crucial, potentially changing the legal framework through which Sarah's actions would be evaluated. "General," Thornhill interjected urgently, "the specific nature of the aid is less important than the violation of federal policy regarding contact with Cherokee fugitives. Any assistance provided to these people undermines removal efforts and encourages continued resistance to lawful authority." The Cherokee warrior chose that moment to address Morrison directly, recognizing in the general someone who might actually listen to Cherokee perspectives rather than dismissing them as irrelevant to military objectives. "Great War Chief," he said formally, using titles that acknowledged Morrison's rank while asserting his own dignity. "Medicine woman, save Cherokee boy when death was certain. Sacred law make her Cherokee family. Cherokee people protect family even if protecting cost Cherokee lives." Morrison absorbed this explanation with professional attention, clearly understanding implications that escaped Thornhill's more rigid thinking. "So, the Cherokee presence here is protective rather than aggressive. You're guarding someone you consider family rather than planning attacks on civilian settlements." "Cherokee people peaceful when peace possible," the warrior confirmed. "Fight only when fighting necessary to protect sacred obligations. Medicine woman now, sacred obligation that cannot be abandoned." Morrison nodded slowly, processing information that painted a very different picture from the hostile conspiracy that Thornhill had described. "Colonel," Morrison said quietly, "it appears that we may be dealing with cultural obligations rather than military hostility. That changes the appropriate response significantly." Thornhill's face showed his shock at seeing his superior officer take Cherokee claims seriously, rather than dismissing them as savage manipulation. "Sir, with respect, cultural obligations don't supersede federal law. These people are fugitives from justice who must be apprehended regardless of their claimed motivations." Morrison's expression hardened as he recognized the inflexibility that had characterized Thornhill's entire approach to Cherokee relations. Colonel, federal law also includes provisions for humanitarian exceptions and cultural considerations. Not every situation requires maximum force as the primary solution. The rebuke was delivered with quiet authority that left no doubt about Morrison's assessment of Thornhill's judgment. But before the disagreement between the two officers could be resolved, a new complication emerged that would test everyone's commitment to peaceful solutions. The unmistakable sound of a grizzly bear's roar echoed across the valley, coming from the direction of the forest where Cherokee warriors were hidden. The massive predator that had originally attacked Ayanna had apparently followed the scent trail to its conclusion, arriving at the worst possible moment to turn an already explosive situation into a three-way crisis that no one was prepared to handle. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized that the grizzly was about to encounter hidden Cherokee warriors who were focused on military threats rather than natural predators. The bear that had started this entire chain of events was about to return with deadly timing that could trigger the very violence that Morrison was trying to prevent. In the space of heartbeats, their complex human drama was about to become a desperate fight for survival against a force of nature that recognized no law, sacred or secular, except the ancient imperative of the hunt. The grizzly bear that emerged from the forest was a creature out of nightmares, massive beyond anything Sarah had imagined when Ayanna first described his attacker. Standing nearly 8 feet tall on its hind legs, the beast carried the scars of countless battles etched into its dark fur, with one ear completely missing, and claw marks across its snout that spoke of territorial fights with other predators. Fresh wounds on its face confirmed this was indeed the same bear that had nearly killed the Cherokee boy, and its aggressive posture suggested it had come seeking either revenge or the completion of interrupted prey. The grizzly's massive bulk seemed to absorb light itself, its dark coat rippling with muscles that could crush a man's skull with a single swipe. Yellow eyes burned with intelligence and fury as it tested the air, sorting through the complex mix of scents to identify specific targets. The creature's breathing came in harsh, rumbling sounds that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself, and when it opened its mouth to release a warning roar, teeth the size of cavalry sabers gleamed white against the black interior of its throat. The effect on the assembled humans was immediate and electric. Military formations designed to combat human enemies proved useless against a predator that recognized no rules of engagement and showed no fear of superior numbers. Horses reared and screamed in terror, their eyes rolling white with primal fear, as the scent of the massive carnivore triggered every instinct for flight that evolution had programmed into prey animals. Several mounts threw their riders immediately, while others began bucking so violently that experienced cavalrymen struggled to maintain their seats. "Form defensive positions," General Morrison barked, his voice cutting through the chaos as 40 cavalry soldiers struggled to control panicked mounts while drawing weapons designed for warfare rather than dangerous game hunting. "Dismount and establish a firing line." But even as he gave orders, Morrison's experienced eye recognized that standard military tactics were inadequate against a grizzly bear in full aggressive mode. Sergeant Major Williams attempted to organize his men into the standard square formation that had proven effective against charging cavalry, but the grizzly's unpredictable movement patterns and massive size made conventional defensive tactics almost useless. Soldiers who had faced Confederate charges and Indian war parties found themselves dealing with an enemy that operated according to completely different rules of engagement. The Cherokee warrior who had been negotiating with the military officers reacted with the fluid efficiency of someone raised in a world where such encounters were a constant possibility. His bow appeared in his hands with practiced speed, an arrow nocked and ready, while his clear whistle sent signals to his hidden companions that transformed their military ambush positions into hunting formations designed for large predators. Within seconds, the entire tactical situation had shifted from a military standoff between human enemies to a desperate wildlife emergency that required completely different skills and strategies. The Cherokee warriors moved through the forest with the silent efficiency of experienced hunters, taking positions that would allow coordinated fire without endangering their human allies. Sarah found herself in the surreal position of watching. Sworn enemies instantly become allies in the face of a threat that transcended all human conflicts. Soldiers and Cherokee warriors began coordinating their movements with the unconscious cooperation of people who understood that survival depended on unity rather than division. Political boundaries and racial hatred seemed suddenly irrelevant. When confronted with 800 pounds of muscle, claw, and predatory intelligence. "That's the bear that attacked the boy," Sarah called out, hoping to provide crucial intelligence that might save lives. "It's wounded and angry, probably tracking scent trails that led it here. The boy cut it with his knife during the original attack, so it's already learned to associate pain with human contact." Her words galvanized both groups as they realized this wasn't a random encounter, but the culmination of events that had started with Ayanna's rescue. Lieutenant Parker, still mounted despite his horse's terror, managed to shout questions while fighting to control his animal. "How do we kill something that size? Standard military ammunition won't bring down a creature that massive quickly enough to prevent casualties." His question reflected the desperate realization that none of their training had prepared them for this situation. The Grizzly dropped to all fours and began advancing toward the largest concentration of humans with the deliberate pace of a predator that had never learned to fear anything in its mountain domain. Its massive head swayed back and forth as it tested scent patterns, clearly seeking something specific among the complex mix of human and animal odors that filled the clearing. The bear's movements were hypnotically fluid for such a massive creature, each step covering ground with deceptive speed that could close distances faster than human reflexes could react. General Morrison made a command decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. "Cherokee warriors," he called out in a voice that carried across the clearing, "we need your expertise with large game hunting. This creature is beyond normal military experience." The unprecedented request for cooperation from a high-ranking army officer sent shockwaves through both groups, but desperate times had created desperate necessities. The Cherokee response was immediate and professional. Running Bear himself emerged from concealment, having arrived with additional warriors after receiving signals about the military confrontation. His appearance added both leadership and crucial hunting experience to their desperate situation. Behind him came 6 more Cherokee warriors, each carrying weapons and equipment specifically designed for hunting large predators in mountain terrain. "Medicine woman," Running Bear called out, his voice steady despite the approaching threat. "Grizzly track boys sent to you. It confused, angry, but also smart. Old Bear know humans have injured it before, want revenge for pain." His analysis provided crucial insight into the predator's motivations and behavior patterns that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Running Bear continued his assessment, while Cherokee warriors took positions around the clearing's perimeter. This bear hunt people before, learned to fear bullets but not enough to stay away. Wounded bears most dangerous because pain make them desperate, willing to take risks healthy bear would avoid. The information was delivered with the clinical precision of someone who had survived countless encounters with dangerous predators. Sarah realized with growing horror that her cabin represented the end point of the scent trail the Grizzly had been following for days, Ayana's blood and the medical supplies used to treat him had created an olfactory beacon that drew the massive predator directly to the location where its intended prey had found sanctuary. The bear had probably been tracking these scents since the original attack, following an increasingly fresh trail that led inevitably to this confrontation. "We need to lead it away from the cabin," Sarah declared, understanding that her home and livelihood were about to become the focal point of a battle she never could have imagined. If it associates this place with the boy's scent, it won't stop until it destroys everything here searching for its original prey. Colonel Thornhill, who had been watching the developments with growing frustration at seeing his military operation transformed into a wildlife emergency, finally grasped an opportunity to reassert his authority. "This is exactly why Cherokee presence in this territory is unacceptable," he declared loudly. "Their activities attract dangerous predators that threaten civilian populations." Running Bear's response carried the patient dignity of someone explaining obvious facts to children. "Colonel, speak foolishness. Bear attacked Cherokee boy in Cherokee hunting grounds far from white settlements. Bear follow trail here because wounded. Boy seek healing from medicine woman. Blame Cherokee for Bear's anger, like blame storm for wind." His logic was unassailable, but Thornhill's prejudices ran too deep for easy correction. The exchange might have escalated into renewed human conflict, but the Grizzly chose that moment to charge. With shocking speed for such a massive creature, it launched itself toward the nearest group of soldiers with the explosive power that made these predators the apex hunters of North American wilderness. The bear's acceleration was terrifying to witness, its massive bulk moving with the fluid grace of a much smaller predator while covering ground at speeds that made retreat impossible. Sergeant Major Williams, a veteran of frontier campaigns who had faced charging cavalry and howling war parties, found himself scrambling backward as 800 pounds of muscle, claw, and fury bore down on his position. His rifle shot took the bear high in the shoulder, a wound that would have dropped most creatures, but only seemed to enrage the grizzly further. The bullet's impact was visible as a spray of blood and fur, but the massive predator barely slowed its charge. Cherokee arrows began flying from multiple positions, their broad hunting points designed specifically for large game rather than human targets. The coordination between hidden Cherokee archers was flawless, each warrior targeting different parts of the bear's anatomy to maximize damage while avoiding positions that might endanger their allies. The arrows struck with wet, thudding sounds that spoke of deep penetration, but the grizzly's thick hide and massive muscle mass absorbed punishment that would have killed smaller predators instantly. "Aim for the heart and lungs," Running Bear commanded in English, ensuring that both Cherokee and military forces could coordinate their fire effectively. Headshots only anger Bear more unless perfectly placed. His expertise proved invaluable, as soldiers who had never hunted dangerous game learned crucial lessons about effective shot placement under the most dangerous circumstances possible. The Grizzly's roar of pain and fury shook the entire clearing as multiple wounds began taking their toll. But instead of weakening the creature, the injuries seemed to fuel its rage, transforming what might have been a territorial display into a fight to the death that would end only when either the bear or its human opponents lay still. Sarah found herself in the unprecedented position of directing a joint military operation between people who had been enemies moments before. "The bear's favoring its left side," she called out, remembering Ayana's description of wounding the predator during their initial encounter. "That's where the boy cut it with his knife. The muscle damage might be making it more vulnerable on that flank." General Morrison was leading by example, his own rifle speaking with steady rhythm as he placed shot after shot into the grizzly's center mass. But even multiple hits from military weapons seemed insufficient to stop the creature's rampage as it scattered soldiers and sent horses fleeing in all directions. The bear's thick hide and subcutaneous fat layer were providing protection that made even well-placed shots less effective than they would be against human opponents. The grizzly seemed to be everywhere at once, its massive bulk moving with impossible speed as it charged from one group of humans to another. Claws the size of railroad spikes left gouges in trees and rocks as the creature used its environment for leverage and intimidation. The sound of its breathing had become a constant rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, while its roars created echoes that bounced off the mountain peaks surrounding the valley. Private Johnson, barely 18 years old and fresh from training, found himself face to face with the charging predator when his horse stumbled and threw him directly into the bear's path. The young soldier's scream of terror galvanized both Cherokee and military forces as they realized that casualties were becoming inevitable unless something changed the tactical situation immediately. The turning point came when young Ayanna himself appeared at the edge of the clearing, having traveled with Running Bear's reinforcement party despite his healing injuries. The sight of the boy who had escaped its claws seemed to focus the grizzly's rage with laser intensity, transforming its random aggression into purposeful hunting behavior that made it even more dangerous. "No!" Sarah screamed, realizing that Ayanna's presence had just elevated the danger exponentially. The bear abandoned its attack on the soldiers and wheeled toward the Cherokee boy with the single-minded determination of a predator that had found its true target. Running Bear moved to intercept, but the distance was too great and the bear's speed too overwhelming for any rescue attempt to succeed. The grizzly's charge toward Ayanna was unstoppable, its massive bulk covering the distance between them with terrifying speed. Cherokee arrows struck its hide like rain, but the creature's momentum carried it forward, despite wounds that would have felled smaller predators. The boy stood frozen with a mixture of terror and fascination, recognizing the creature that had nearly ended his life just days before. What happened next would be remembered for generations as the moment when enemies became family through shared courage in the face of death itself. Lieutenant Parker, the young officer who had initially come to arrest Sarah, spurred his terrified horse directly at the charging grizzly in a desperate attempt to draw its attention away from Ayanna. His sacrifice provided the crucial seconds that allowed Cherokee arrows and military bullets to find vital targets. Parker's horse collided with the bear's flank just as the creature reached for Ayanna with claws that could have disemboweled the boy with a single swipe. The impact sent both horse and bear tumbling, but also threw the young officer from his saddle with bone-crushing force. His desperate courage had saved Ayanna's life, but at a cost that left him unconscious and possibly dying on the forest floor. The grizzly recovered from the collision with the fluid grace that made these predators so dangerous, but the impact had given Cherokee and military forces the opportunity they needed to coordinate their final assault. Running Bear's arrows struck vital organs with the precision that came from a lifetime of hunting, while General Morrison's rifle found the heart with a shot that finally began to slow the massive creature's rampage. But it was Sarah herself who delivered the decisive blow. With William's old hunting rifle, the weapon that had kept her alive through 4 years of mountain solitude, she placed a single shot behind the grizzly's left shoulder that penetrated to its heart. The massive predator stumbled, roared once, more with defiant fury, and collapsed mere yards from where Ayanna stood frozen with a mixture of terror and awe. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of heavy breathing and the distant whinnying of scattered horses. Soldiers and Cherokee warriors alike stared at the massive carcass, hardly believing that the creature which had dominated their world for the past terrifying minutes was finally still. The grizzly's body seemed impossibly large in death, its massive bulk testament to the power they had faced and overcome through unprecedented cooperation. General Morrison was the first to speak, his voice carrying wonder mixed with professional assessment. In 30 years of frontier service, I've never seen anything like that level of cooperation between our forces and indigenous warriors. Without Cherokee expertise, we would have suffered significant casualties. His words carried the weight of someone whose military experience provided context for understanding just how remarkable their survival had been. Running Bear approached the fallen grizzly with the reverence that Cherokee culture accorded to worthy opponents. "Old Bear fought with honor," he said formally, placing his hand on the creature's massive head. "Spirit of Bear, now join ancestors, no longer angry, no longer hunting." He turned to face the assembled soldiers and civilians with an expression that mixed grief for the necessary killing with pride in their collective achievement. "All people here show courage together," Running Bear continued with ceremonial formality. "Cherokee warriors, white soldiers, medicine woman, young officer who risked life for Cherokee boy. This create new sacred bond between peoples that cannot be broken by politics or prejudice." His words carried the weight of cultural law that would bind Cherokee people to specific obligations regardless of changing political circumstances. Colonel Thornhill was struggling to process events that challenged every assumption he'd held about Cherokee character and capabilities. The warriors he'd dismissed as savages had just demonstrated tactical sophistication that impressed even his experienced sergeants, while risking their lives to protect both Cherokee and white personnel from a common threat. His entire worldview was crumbling under the weight of evidence that contradicted decades of military indoctrination. "General," he said quietly, his voice lacking its earlier certainty, "I may have misjudged the situation here. These Cherokee have demonstrated loyalty and courage that challenges everything I've been taught about their nature." Morrison nodded approvingly at what represented a significant evolution in his subordinate's thinking. "Colonel, what we've witnessed today suggests that cooperation between our peoples might serve American interests better than continued conflict," Morrison replied diplomatically. "These Cherokee have demonstrated loyalty, courage, and tactical skill that could benefit frontier security rather than threatening it." The general's words carried implications that could reshape military policy throughout the territorial district. Sarah found herself surrounded by people who had been strangers or enemies just hours before, but who now shared the bond of having faced death together and emerged victorious through mutual support and sacrifice. Lieutenant Parker, despite a dislocated shoulder from being thrown by his horse, was receiving medical attention from Cherokee healers whose skills complemented her own frontier medicine. "Mrs. McKinnon," General Morrison addressed her formally, "your actions today have demonstrated that humanitarian instincts and practical security needs are not mutually exclusive. The sacred bond you formed with these Cherokee appears to serve both communities' interests better than the policies we've been implementing." His recognition carried the weight of potential policy changes that could affect Cherokee survival. Throughout the territory, Ayanna approached Sarah with the careful dignity of someone whose life had been saved twice by the same person, first from the bear's initial attack and now from its final revenge. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of formal ceremony that would create obligations extending far beyond personal gratitude. "Medicine woman," he said in English clear enough for all to understand, "you save Cherokee boy from bear. Then save Cherokee boy from bear again. Sacred debt now doubled, can never be repaid, but Cherokee people will spend all generations trying to honor debt through service to Medicine Woman and her people." The formal declaration created bonds that would transcend individual relationships to encompass entire communities. Running Bear stepped forward to formalize what Ayanna had declared, understanding that this moment required the kind of ceremonial recognition that would make their alliance binding under Cherokee law. General Morrison, Colonel Thornhill, all white soldiers, he announced with the authority of a chief addressing a council. Cherokee Nation pledge protection and alliance. To medicine woman Sarah McKinnon and all who call her friend. Sacred bond now extend to include those who fight beside Cherokee against common enemies. The implications were staggering. What had begun as a military operation to arrest a suspected collaborator had transformed into an alliance that could reshape frontier relations throughout the territory. General Morrison recognized the historical significance of what he was witnessing, understanding that his response could influence federal Indian policy for years to come. "Running bear," he replied formally, his words carrying the weight of military authority that could commit government resources to honoring Cherokee agreements. General Morrison accept Cherokee friendship on behalf of United States Army. Sacred. Bond honored, protection guaranteed for Cherokee people who choose peace over war. The exchange created precedents that neither man could fully comprehend, but both recognized as fundamentally important to their people's futures. As the sun set over the Great Smoky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed to celebrate the day's unexpected resolution, Sarah stood surrounded by people who had become family through shared danger and mutual respect. The grizzly bear that had started this entire chain of events lay still beside her cabin, its death marking not just the end of a threat, but the beginning of something unprecedented in the violent history of Cherokee white relations. The sacred bond that had begun with one woman's choice to help a wounded boy had grown into an alliance that transcended racial boundaries and political divisions. In the remote mountains of Tennessee, individual acts of courage had created ripples of transformation that would spread far beyond their origins, proving that mercy once chosen has the power to reshape even the most impossible circumstances into expressions of hope that could last for generations. 7 days after the grizzly bear's death, Sarah woke to a sight that would have been impossible to imagine just a week earlier. Where once her isolated mountain homestead had stood alone against the wilderness, now a thriving community sprawled across the valley floor. Cherokee families had established permanent settlements alongside white pioneers who had journeyed from distant settlements to witness what people were already calling the miracle of Sweetwater Valley. The transformation was so complete, it seemed like something from a fever dream. Smoke rose from dozens of carefully constructed shelters as both peoples prepared for the approaching winter season together. Children who had never seen members of the other race now played elaborate games that combined Cherokee storytelling traditions with frontier competitions, their laughter echoing across mountainsides that had known mostly silence for generations. The morning brought visitors who would test the fragile alliance in ways none of them had anticipated. A delegation of Cherokee chiefs from distant mountain refugees approached the valley under a flag of truce, led by an ancient war leader whose reputation for implacable hostility toward all white people was legendary throughout the region. Chief Dragging Wolf had spent 60 years fighting European colonists and American settlers, losing 3 sons to military campaigns that had steadily reduced Cherokee territory to scattered fragments hidden in the most inaccessible mountain wilderness. General Morrison, Dragging Wolf announced in English that was precise despite his advanced age, "I come to see this white medicine woman who has stolen the loyalty of Cherokee warriors with her magic." The accusation carried dangerous implications, suggesting that Sarah's influence over local Cherokee might be viewed as witchcraft or manipulation by traditional leaders. Sarah stepped forward to face the legendary war chief with the same courage that had led her to shelter Ayanna despite the personal risks involved. Chief Dragging Wolf, she replied with respectful formality. "I am Sarah McKinnon, and I used no magic except the healing skills that any decent person should possess when faced with a wounded child." The elderly Cherokee leader studied her with eyes that had witnessed decades of white betrayal and broken promises. His weathered face bore the scars of countless battles, while his bearing radiated the authority of someone who had never retreated from any challenge. "White medicine woman speaks of healing and decency," Dragging Wolf observed with skeptical precision, "but Cherokee people have heard such words before from white leaders who promised peace while preparing for war." Running Bear moved to stand beside Sarah, his presence offering support while demonstrating the bonds that had formed through shared danger. "Grandfather," he said respectfully, "Medicine Woman saved my son's life when death was certain. She fought beside Cherokee warriors, against common enemy. She shares food, shelter, knowledge with Cherokee families who have nowhere else to turn." But Dragging Wolf's expression suggested that such evidence was insufficient to overcome decades of accumulated distrust. Individual kindness does not change the nature of white government that drives Cherokee people from ancestral lands like animals before hunters. Ayanna chose that moment to approach the group, moving with careful dignity despite the healing wounds that still marked his encounter with the grizzly bear. "Grandfather Dragging Wolf," Ayanna said formally. "I am Ayanna, son of Running Bear. Medicine Woman found me dying from bear attack and chose healing over hatred. When soldiers came to arrest her for helping Cherokee boy, Cherokee warriors and white soldiers fought together against the great bear that hunted all of us." The young man's testimony carried weight precisely because of his youth and obvious sincerity. His description of the grizzly bear battle was vivid and detailed, emphasizing how natural it had seemed for people to work together when facing a common threat. "When Great Bear charged toward me seeking revenge," Ayanna concluded, "young white officer rode his horse into Bear's path to save Cherokee boy's life. This is not behavior of people who see Cherokee as less than human." Dragging Wolf absorbed this account with careful attention. The story challenged his worldview in fundamental ways, while providing concrete evidence of white people choosing Cherokee welfare over their own safety. "And after this battle," the elderly chief continued his investigation, "what happened between Cherokee people and white soldiers?" General Morrison recognized that this moment would determine whether the alliance forged in crisis could survive the scrutiny of traditional Cherokee leadership. "Chief Dragging Wolf," he replied formally, "the agreement establishes Sweetwater Valley as permanent Cherokee territory under United States protection. Any white settlement here requires Cherokee consent, and Cherokee families have guaranteed access to traditional hunting grounds throughout the mountain region." The unprecedented nature of these terms created astonished murmurs among both Cherokee and white observers. Never before had American authorities granted territorial rights to Cherokee communities while acknowledging their sovereignty over white settlement in designated areas. "Medicine Woman," Dragging Wolf said directly, "Cherokee Nation has many families hidden in mountains, children growing weak from hunger, elders dying from diseases that Cherokee healers cannot cure. If sacred bond real, will Medicine Woman extend healing to Cherokee people she has never met?" The question was both a test of Sarah's character and a practical inquiry about resources that could mean survival for Cherokee communities struggling to exist in remote wilderness refuges. "Chief Dragging Wolf," she replied without hesitation, "healing knowledge means nothing if it's not shared with those who need it most. I'll teach Cherokee healers everything I know about frontier medicine, and I'll treat any Cherokee family that comes here seeking help." The elderly chief's expression softened slightly as he recognized the genuine nature of her offer. "Medicine Woman speaks truth that Cherokee hearts can recognize," he said approvingly. But white woman alone cannot provide healing for all Cherokee families. Sacred bond must include white soldiers, white government, white people who have power to help or harm Cherokee communities. General Morrison understood that Dragging Wolf was challenging him to expand the alliance beyond military cooperation into broader policy changes. "Chief Dragging Wolf," he replied carefully, "I'll recommend to Washington that Sweetwater Valley become a model for Cherokee-American cooperation throughout the region. Medical cooperation, trade relationships, mutual defense agreements that serve both people's interests. And if Washington refuses these recommendations," Dragging Wolf pressed, testing the general's commitment when higher authorities might prefer traditional policies of Cherokee removal, "then I'll resign my commission rather than implement policies that destroy something that serves American interests better than anything we've tried before," Morrison replied with quiet dignity. The commitment carried enormous personal risk for a career military officer, but it demonstrated the depth of his conviction about the alliance's value. Dragging Wolf studied the general's face with the intensity of someone whose life had depended on reading the truth in other people's eyes. Finally, he nodded slowly. "White general speaks with honor that Cherokee people can respect," Dragging Wolf declared formally. "Dragging Wolf will carry word to all Cherokee bands that sacred bond with Medicine Woman includes protection from white soldiers, healing from white medicine, cooperation instead of war." As the formal negotiations continued throughout the day, Sarah found herself at the center of discussions that would reshape frontier relations for generations to come. Cherokee families began emerging from deep mountain hiding places, bringing with them children who had never seen white people except as distant enemies, and elderly tribal members whose knowledge of traditional ways could be preserved through cooperation rather than lost to warfare. The medical station that Dr. Matthews had proposed became reality within days, as Cherokee healers and white medical practitioners began sharing knowledge that benefited both communities. Cherokee understanding of medicinal plants complemented frontier surgical techniques, while traditional Cherokee healing practices proved effective for conditions that conventional medicine struggled to treat. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation occurred among the children of both communities. Cherokee and white youngsters who had been raised to fear and hate each other instead formed friendships that transcended every artificial boundary their elders had created. Their games combined Cherokee athletic competitions with frontier skills challenges, while their stories blended Cherokee spiritual traditions with European fairy tales in ways that created entirely new cultural expressions. The economic benefits of cooperation became apparent within weeks as Cherokee knowledge of mountain resources combined with white trading connections to create prosperity that neither community could have achieved alone. Cherokee hunters provided game and furs that white traders could exchange for manufactured goods, while white agricultural techniques helped Cherokee families establish more reliable food sources in their mountain refuges. As winter approached, and the alliance faced its first seasonal test, Sarah realized that her simple choice to help a wounded boy had created ripples of transformation that reached far beyond anything she could have imagined. The sacred bond that had begun with individual mercy had grown into institutional changes that offered hope for peaceful coexistence between peoples who had seemed destined for eternal conflict. The cabin that had once stood alone against the wilderness now anchored a community that proved cooperation was not only possible, but profitable for everyone involved. Cherokee families found security and medical care, while white settlers gained allies who knew the mountain country better than any government survey could map. The true measure of transformation became evident in the stories that began spreading throughout the frontier region. Tales of the white medicine woman who had earned Cherokee loyalty through courage and compassion, of Cherokee warriors who had saved white soldiers from a monster bear, of children who played together despite racial boundaries that adults had insisted were permanent fixtures of the natural order. These stories carried power that went beyond simple entertainment, offering proof that individual choices could indeed change the course of history when people chose mercy over hatred, cooperation over conflict, and hope over the familiar patterns of prejudice and violence that had dominated frontier relations for so long. As Sarah stood on her porch watching Cherokee and white families preparing for winter together, she understood that the legacy of her choice would continue growing long after those who had planted its seeds passed into legend. The sacred bond that protected her had become something much larger, a testament to the truth that mercy, once chosen, has power to reshape even the most impossible circumstances into expressions of hope that could last for generations. In the remote mountains of Tennessee, individual acts of courage had created a community that proved peace was not only possible, but more beneficial than war for everyone involved. The transformation was complete, and there would be no returning to the old ways of hatred and fear. The future belonged to those who chose to see humanity in supposed enemies, and that future had begun in a simple mountain cabin where one woman had chosen healing over hatred when a wounded boy had needed help. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.